What does that look like? Hey guys, how's it going? Just setting up here. Oh, let's turn you this way. Then everyone can hear me. So, what's up, everyone? Today we are talking about X of Swords, the final issues. Now, these are events that go way back to November, but since that time I'd been waylaid with a bunch of random nonsense and got a little busy. Tevye Smoka, thanks for joining us. We already have people kind of coming in on the stream. So, for various reasons, we just weren't able to really cover this. I got sidetracked with other stuff. We had the finale of Death Metal to cover. I have this huge backlog of comics I haven't read and talked about yet. And kind of chief among them is X of Swords. And there's like a whole other Marvel event I haven't even talked about as well. So, it's a whole thing. And it gets into Marvel's, like, amount of events and the volume of comics they put out. Because this thing was in 22 parts. And we've covered them all. But I did get tired of it at a certain point. Even though the story itself I mostly have good things to say about. So with another X-Men style event potentially around the corner and then building up towards new stuff, I feel it's a good time for us to talk about the ending. Tevye is asking how my day's going. It's going good. I have some interesting stuff coming up, so we're kind of getting this done a little early in the day. I do sort of have a hard out at some point, so we are going to keep it like within an hour long review, hopefully, but we'll see how it goes. Tevye said, I found this event to be way too long. I think that it has a lot of issues with pacing, especially in its first half, which is pretty much just build-up and leading to all this stuff. I do have to say I find the world of X-Men as it currently exists, in the world of Krakoa and all of these politics and all of these other worlds introduced, or like changed, at least for the context of X's Swords, is interesting and comfortable. And I often find I can kind of sit in it and enjoy the story. So, yeah, it's long, but when I do get around to reading these books, often taking some time, even if it is like months after the fact, has helped me enjoy it by giving this a huge long break, because a lot of these books I've read recently. On the other hand, this latter stuff, like when I did actually finally get around to reading them, was pretty good. If I had forced myself through it, I probably would be a little more mindful of like how long it is and how difficult it is to keep up with it. I am not caught up with X-Men goings on post this story, and we're going to kind of just start from here, and then I'll sort of build up from that with other videos. With that in mind, we're going to start with X-Force and basically continue all the way on through the end of this event. And a lot of this can be summarized pretty quickly with just the simple phrase, the tournament continues. There's a lot of back and forth. There's some great pages and a lot of really excellent artwork kind of throughout X's Swords, just showing round after round and that sort of thing. But by and large, it's pretty fun stuff, I should say. I was going to say pretty simple stuff, but that's not really true. It's a fun mix of the X-Men solving puzzles, rolling a boulder up a hill, looking for stuff in space, all these crazy challenges between Arakko and Krakoa. But Arakko shores up and firms a pretty consistent lead. There's a chase of sorts through the Crooked Market that ends with one of Arakko's people being imprisoned as a result of their behavior, but they do win the round even. And we kind of get a nice little summary of what's happened so far. As a reminder, Psylocke, the Betsy Braddock side of her, died basically, as far as we can tell, but this story has a little more to say on that. Then there's a great sequence between Death and Storm in the realm of Sabaleth, which is full of like vampires and stuff. It leads to Death basically being devoured by them. But like the Krakoans, they seem to be able to resurrect themselves too. Tevi says, I agree, the artwork is fantastic. It's very consistently good and so imaginative as we are exploring these different worlds across these books. It's why a huge part of what I get excited about when we're reading these stories. Next up are two books I don't actually have the print copy of. I read digitally just because I kind of lost them in the shuffle of all this. It's Hellions number 10, which kind of follows up on what was set up as a quest to sort of preemptively strike against Araco. Clearly goes wrong because we're deep into the tournament now. Araco has all their swords, and the Hellions are just kind of off in Avalon and other places, being murdered, more or less. A good chunk of them do make it back to Krakoa throughout their journey, but it all goes horribly wrong and really goes nowhere beyond just Sinestro being like, oh, we're screwed, which is the message he brings back to Krakoa. But he also kills all the team members, even the ones who make it back with him, because it's really more about him scheming and seeking his own power, and that will kind of be continued on in that series. That goes on into Cable, where basically he gets his ass handed to him. He handedly loses, and it's a fight to the death, but his death of spirit is enough for Saturnine to consider the round to him. And we just get all these rounds toppling towards the X-Men, or towards Araco, until the White Spire of Death has this other challenge with Gorgon. And he just starts throwing his men at Gorgon. Hundreds of men, basically, that like Gorgon's just barely taking down. His eyes get gouged out, and he eventually falls. But every time Gorgon kills someone, he gets a point for Krakoa, and that suddenly swings the tournament in their favor. And basically it ends with one final confrontation between Apocalypse and his wife. As we've learned, Apocalypse had a family. Genesis was his wife, and he had all these children who were the original horsemen of the Apocalypse. Then Krakoa split with Araco across dimensions, basically, and Araco fell to this mask thing called the Annihilation Mask that Genesis now currently wears. We then cut back to Krakoa. Jean Grey and Scott are kind of planning something, and they insist on going off and rescuing their son because they just heard this dire message from Cable. They don't really know much about the tournament, but they have a sense they're losing and they want to go help. They have this weird confrontation with the Quiet Council that basically ends with Scott resigning, kind of, while Apocalypse battles Genesis. And there's a lot of talking. There's pages and pages of this 9-panel nonsense where they're all going off, but Sebastian Shaw insists anyone who goes has to leave. So Scott's really the only one who goes among the Quiet Council, and they even kind of try and forbid him from doing it, but he just insists on doing so, impressing both Xavier and Magneto, who think he's going to do what they basically raised him to do, they feel, which is just like to rescue their friends at any cost, even if the Quiet Council just kind of needs to distance themselves politically from it and prepare for what happens if they fail and if an invasion occurs. And Araco really is coming in to take over Krakoa and with it Earth. So the duel goes on, but Apocalypse actually kind of wins and beats his wife, and she yields. And Apocalypse turns to Saturnine and says, I don't want this. It's a very interesting moment for a villain like that. And Saturnine says, this needs to be settled, but the Annihilation Mask, or helmet, I guess is a better term for it, says, like, put me on, and says, we are not settled. I will not yield. Nothing is settled. And that brings us into the final two issues. Tevi was saying, I still miss Adult Cable. It still very much feels as though we're going to explore that stuff a little bit here. I just kind of need to straighten myself out a bit. There we go. Adult Cable still very much feels like part of the story of Cable's own solo series, and I'm not up to date with that, so I'm not really sure what's going on with that. Tevi says, I also noticed Gwenpool in the final fight, which is odd because she's technically a mutant. I think that's just a fun little cameo, because it is this, like, this realm exists as a node across different multiverses and stuff, and so I feel very much can be a place where these things exist. But especially at the Starlight Citadel, which stands at the apex of like all multiverses is or like the entire multiverse, I guess is what I'm trying to say. K5, thanks for hopping on. Oh, we're getting a good amount of people in stream at this point. Aggressively Relaxing says, adult Cable coming back has been teased. That's what I kind of feel is very much the case too. And it's in the story and kind of built in at this point. So, Excalibur opens with things having considerably escalated, and the forces of Araco have basically come to invade, but the White Spire is basically like, this is no fight, and just walks off. And in a lot of ways, the forces of Araco are kind of fracturing. Bay, who's now Doug's wife over in the New Mutants, runs off to find him, and basically grabs her husband, Karma, and runs off with him. Attacking the other X-Men in the process. Meanwhile, Saturnine is forming this puzzle together and says that it'll be necessary for her to find the future, while Jubilee emerges with a bunch of people from these archers and stuff that fly around. I don't know. They're what are they called? The Green Troop or something like that. And she wants to help her son Shogo, obviously, but they're kind of trying to just face off against the forces of Araco to begin with, who are this overwhelming power that they've been teased this whole time. Meanwhile, the X-Men are basically surrounded and have little hope, but just then Saturnine finishes the puzzle, and it's Betsy Braddock. Basically, across the multiverse, all these versions of Betsy emerge at the Citadel, and the Captain Britain Corps is reformed. But unlike them being composed of all different versions of Brian, they're now all the different versions of Betsy. It's a really fun twist that leads us right into the final issue, X of Swords Destruction, which is this big exercise thing which, kind of starts to fall a little bit into the sensibilities of the older event. Older Marvel events, I should say. Up until now, the tournament's kind of been weird. It hasn't been a traditional series of fights, but rather a series of weird competitions. Stuff like an eating contest or a drinking contest, a dance-off, all these odd things that Saturnine has dreamt up as a competition between these two forces. But now we're kind of falling into this big epic fight between Genesis and her forces, and she summons, using the summoners, which is a neat little twist from a lot of existing Hickman content and sorts, to basically pull from the deepest, darkest pits of Araco. But meanwhile, Scott and Jean have finally emerged with their plan, and they emerge with Sword's headquarters and summon the crazy, violent, dark force that wiped out Sword, basically, on the station. These guys from the Abyss that just start attacking Araco's forces and really start to even the odds. So then we have this big epic fight, and to be fair, unlike a lot of other events, we've built up to this for a long time. A lot of X-Men content has been leading in this direction, and it is pretty epic seeing all these different characters facing off. And Apocalypse finally manages to beat down Genesis and rip off the Annihilation Helm, only for it to kind of consume him, and him to put it on, and him to take over. And he tries to fight it and resist it, and he actually does manage to yield to Saturnine and surrender. Basically, she takes the helm and reforms it into something that will still corrupt its user and have an influence on them, but not be as overwhelming as the Annihilation Helm, and says the forces of Araco and this darkness need to be put in rein so they're not so aggressive, but they will still continue to exist. And so then we get into the final thing, and she says there needs to be this show of peace between the two sides if we're going to have this détente and both continue to exist. So she asks each side to name a mutant from the opposing side that will live on, so one resident from Krakoa will live on Araco, one resident from Araco will live on Krakoa from now on. Genesis names her husband and says that Apocalypse will live here from now on. Apocalypse takes the choice, and he chooses Araco, along with the millions of mutant prisoners that live on that island. So they're going to go live on Earth with Krakoa, which is interesting, and Apocalypse and his family are going to return to their world. And Apocalypse basically going there for the first time. And Saturnine is so we're kind of left with the aftermath, and Saturnine's discussing that with her advisor. She now basically has a whole new Captain Britain Corps at her command. Jubilee's reunited with Shogo, and the Sword headquarters return, kind of setting up that series, which we'll review in the future. Storm returns the Sword to Wakanda, with a little bit of a detente there. And the Quiet Council is left forever changed, with Apocalypse gone and Scott having resigned, which will be interesting for what that means for the X-Men rulership. And Saturnine kind of hints that it's the first crack in mutant leadership, and perhaps there will be a fracture going forward or changes with this new island. It's exciting stuff, and kind of gets into what I was saying in earlier reviews of X of Swords, where it seems the direction we were heading was in some sort of unification between Krakoa and Arakko. Krakoa and Arakko, and also all these new characters potentially joining, but not the ones I was necessarily thinking of. Meanwhile, Blight Spoke begins to be raided by Saturnine's forces, so she's clearly this more powerful figure going forward, and has kind of consolidated a lot of power. But I would argue in a kind of a necessary way. She's kind of filling a void that the Captain Britain Corps left wide open when they fell, and it feels right for that to have kind of become a thing. Meanwhile, our Betsy Braddock is still kind of scattered to the world, but not necessarily gone. And the last little few pages of this event do kind of go into a lot of details of what happened to all the swords, what's going on with the accounted for Betsy Braddocks and their variations out there. And that's pretty much where we leave things. By the way, I also just have this pretty cool variant cover for this issue that I'm just going to show off for a minute. Meanwhile, I haven't read chat in a little while, so let's see what people are saying here. Tevia's saying, I still wish Laura was part of this event, but if memory serves, she was still trapped in the vault. I believe so, but it would be kind of cool for her to have been involved. It'd be nice to see Laura Kinney more involved in mainstream X-Men events in general. It kind of feels like she's off doing her own thing up until now with all that Fallen Angel stuff, which kind of felt like the weak link in a lot of X-Men things. So we'll see what that character role is going forward. Tevia's saying, he and Jean Grey are a couple and Jubilee is in Excalibur. That kind of fits with what role we've seen Jubilee in here. And like I said, we'll be talking about Sword. I'm really behind on Excalibur and kind of need to read more of that series to have a better idea of it. Aggressively Relaxing says, I like how all of Apocalypse's years of nonsense is now sweet. It almost is sweet in comparison to what he came from now, like in what we know about like Annihilation and what those forces were like, and in a lot of ways his actions aren't really justified but make more sense. I really like what Apocalypse's character has gone through in the age of Hickman, and the direction that he's kind of not really offered a redemptive arc, but seen basically Xavier and Magneto coming more to his side with Krakoa and wanting to basically help them with that, while also kind of having his own agenda, which we've seen. He does leave a message for those two before he leaves for Arakko, saying that he will meet them again. And that will be interesting. I don't think their story is quite done yet either. But he, as a villain, and like as far as his role in all of this goes, he is interesting, and he will kind of, in my opinion, be missed in the Quiet Council. Among the villains, he was always kind of a voice of reason, and often understood the value in what Xavier and Magneto were doing in a way a lot of others didn't. And I like the character, so it is kind of sad to see him go, but one thing I like about this event is it really feels consequential, and it does feel as though in the age of House of X and stuff, there still very much is room for a future and changes, like in terms of development and character stuff like that, even though we are kind of past the comic book death. It's all stuff that I really approve of, and so I find I am often defensive of it or really embrace it, but I do read these X-Men comics and feel like a very warm and wholesome feeling. I also am very aware and mindful of the fact that I tend to read these books with large gaps and breaks in between them, and in part because they get me really excited for stuff going forward, but also because it's a very slow burn for a lot of these things, and I find it pays off more when some of the stuff builds up a little more, and I'm not just reading them left and right because they're coming out in a huge volume too. So it's a slow burn, but a lot of content, and I find the people who are reading it week to week tend to get a little more sick of it easier, and I could see why, because there's so much of it that I'm very pick and choose about the X-Men, and that has paid off for me. So that does qualify my recommendation a little bit, for sure. Aggressively Relaxing says, Cyclops was not a part of this event, but he gets a wonderful hero moment at the end of it. My brain says that it's silly writing, but I loved it so much. Such a great dad moment. I kind of get what he's saying, because not all of X's Swords is silly. If anything, I think a lot of it's a very mature, interesting event compared to the average Marvel one, and even just thoughtful content overall. But what you're referring to there with Cyclops and him quitting the Quiet Council and going after Cable, a lot of that did feel very simplistic and silly. They got a very ambiguous warning from Cable and probably should have had more faith in their friends. But I definitely think it was, broadly speaking, like an arc in the right direction for Scott. And as simple as it was, that moment kind of felt like it was leading up to the relatively simplistic climax, which is just this big battle. And the big battle kind of worked to me with all of the build-up and stuff. I actually really did like when we got to the point where it's like, hey, there's this new Captain Britain Corps, all this energy was in this final issue, and because we weren't faced with a slog of 21 issues before that, which was nothing but action along these lines, it did feel like a bit of a change in pace and this big climax. And that all is a long way of saying Hickman is a pretty competent writer more than he isn't. And when he's working with all these people, yeah, we have the odd cliche here and there, but and that's true of Hickman in Secret Wars as well. And he kind of gets away with this stuff because he's doing all these other interesting things, and he's doing a lot of other stuff right when it comes to writing. Tevye says, also, Mr. Sinister got what he wanted with gathering DNA. Well, that's kind of what he was all about. I guess I should, Tevye had kind of jogged my memory a bit there, because he went and, the Hellions did face this very messed up and dark version of the X-Men, which kind of gets into what I like about Arakko and how dark all that stuff is. And they ran afoul of them, basically. But Mr. Sinister was doing it all just so he could get some DNA, and he was treating it like he was doing some big mission for X's Swords when really his part in it was useless, kind of deliberately. He was trying to serve his own means there, which is cool. I like how the villains are still villains, even though they've kind of joined up with the X-Men. So Sinister, Shaw, Apocalypse, they're all kind of up to their own thing. We've really seen the full extent of that now with Apocalypse. They're on to Shaw, the other X-Men, and will make him pay for some of his shenanigans, while finally Sinister clearly has his own schemes and is going for a longer game. But I do kind of think, I still hope that the arc of Krakoa is a long-term one, and the X-Men have found their own little place in the world and are going to be able to hold on to it, even if there are changes, like the island itself keeps getting these additions. First with like a whole little monster island, and now with Arakko, which should change things considerably. I'm very curious how all that will end, but I enjoyed it nonetheless. So with that in mind, chat's kind of slowed down, and I'm feeling pretty good about that review, so I think we'll leave things there. But thank you very much for watching, everybody, and we'll see you next time here on Comic Island.